Hi 511, this is Dr. Keisler, and this week we're going to be discussing variables and hypotheses. So hopefully you read the chapter in your Frankel, Wallen, and Hune text on variables and hypotheses, and we're just going to spend a few minutes going over some of the big ideas and the main points of this week's reading. So I chose this picture right out of your text because I think it really exemplifies this idea, this concept of variables, or how many variables you can have when considering your research question, when considering a population to study, or really when thinking about any type of research problem you'd like to explore. So there are lots of different variables that you can identify, as you can see in this picture, right? You could have gender, you could have age, you could have race, you could have hair color, you could have eye color, you could have profession, all types of different variables in there. So what do we mean though when we're talking about this concept of variable? Well, first of all, the idea of variables is related to the importance of studying relationships. So scientists value research that investigates relationships more highly than purely descriptive research. So if you think back to some of the big ideas that many of you were thinking of in your question exploration, or they even give you some examples in your text of questions that some people want to explore or know the answer to or research, lots of those questions dealt with how something happens, what something is, or what changes could occur in something. But a lot of those questions really get at describing a phenomena, right? So we consider them descriptive research. While descriptive research is valuable, one of the issues with purely descriptive research is that it doesn't give us any information about why something is happening. So it does describe the phenomenon, but it doesn't necessarily give us any idea as to why this is occurring, what might be different about this phenomena and another phenomena, why something, people, groups, animals behave in a certain way, or why the characteristics described in the descriptive research are important or significant. And so when we think about research that gives us some of that why, we think about the relationship. So we're really talking about the cause and effect relationship, and that's where this idea or this concept of variable comes in. So what is a variable? A variable is essentially a concept, right? It's a noun that stands for the variation within a class of objects. So a very easy, very simple example of a variable could be eye color. It's something that's different within a certain class of objects, for example, people. Contrast that with a constant, and that constant is a characteristic that has no variations within a class of objects, let's say people. So the example that they give here is the grade level of ninth graders, right? Ninth graders are always going to be in the ninth grade, so there's no variation of the grade level amongst a population or a class of objects, in this case, ninth graders. A variable within that class of objects within ninth graders could be the age of the ninth graders, but grade level would be a constant if you were looking at a group of ninth graders. In developing their research plans, their proposals, and their questions, researchers choose certain variables to study since they kind of have an idea that certain variables are related to the outcome or the thing that they would like to study. So they suspect that there's a possible relationship between the thing that they want to study and the variable they're choosing to examine or manipulate. So the two big classifications of variables are quantitative or categorical variables. So all variables are classified as either quantitative or categorical. A quantitative variable is conceptualized and analyzed into distinct categories with no continuum applied. So it can be subdivided into smaller units. Another way that you can think about it is that a quantitative variable is something that is naturally measured as a number, right? So if it can be naturally measured as a number, it also means that applying some kind of mathematical or arithmetic operation to it makes sense. So an example of a quantitative variable, one that you can apply a number to and then it makes sense to apply that number, the number has significance, would be height, age, GPA, like your grades, temperature, salary, anything really that it makes sense or it's natural to measure that as a number, right? So then any variable that is not quantitative is considered categorical. And a categorical variable does not vary in degree, amount, or quantity, but rather in quality. So if we think, back to this kind of ongoing discussion we have about quantitative versus qualitative, the categorical is considered that quality variable. So there's no middle ground or no in-between measurement. It either is or it is not belonging to that category or class that you give it. So categorical variables then take a value that's one of several possible categories, right? So since it's not naturally measured as a number, it doesn't have any numerical value or numerical meaning. So an example could be hair color, right? Within the variable of hair color, there are then categories. So you are either blonde, you are either brunette, you are either redhead. Gender, you are either male, you're female. They give you the idea of a political party or political affiliation, right? You're either Republican, Democrat, Independent, or other. You're not necessarily some shade of any of those, or it doesn't make sense to naturally apply some number that makes sense to measure that categorical variable. So it's not quantitative, it is categorical. The one kind of little bit of gray area, or sometimes where it gets confusing, is that sometimes categorical variables are kind of disguised as quantitative variables. In research, sometimes the researcher or the team might record categorical information with a code, and so they apply a number to it for coding purposes. So let's say you were surveying, men and women, and you applied all the surveys done by men, you gave a number 1. All the surveys that were done by the women, you gave a number 2. So you do that just for coding, and because it's easier to turn to make sense of data on a spreadsheet. It's easier to manipulate it and to examine it if it's coded quantitatively, but it doesn't necessarily mean then that categorical variable is quantitative, because the numbers assigned to it are just coded. They don't mean anything. So there's no value associated with the fact that men had a 1 or were coded as a 1 and that women were coded as a 2, right? When you think about a true quantitative variable or true quantitative data, having a higher number means that you have more of something, and so higher values have meaning. Simply coding a categorical variable with a number doesn't give it any mathematical meaning. It's really just for organizing and examining the data that you have. So then within that larger umbrella of variables, we also need to consider this idea of independent versus dependent variables, right? So the independent variable is what the researcher studies to see its relationship or its effect. It is what the researcher believes or presumes or posits could be the cause of something happening. Remember a couple of slides ago I said that researchers select the variables that they're going to examine, and so the independent variable is one that they are, thinking or positing could be the potential cause of the phenomenon. Whereas the dependent variable is that thing that's being influenced or affected by the independent variable. So it is the results or the outcome. When a researcher designs a study that uses independent and dependent variables, it's that independent variable that is the factor that's measured, manipulated, or selected by the researcher or the team because they want to determine its relationship to the observed phenomenon. Right? So it's that thing that they're examining, it's that thing that can be manipulated, as opposed to the dependent variable, which is that factor that's observed and measured to determine the effect of the independent variable. So they take that independent variable, they apply it to the dependent variable, and then they measure the effects of it. So if you think about the independent variable as that factor that can appear, disappear, or vary as the experimenter, the researcher, or the team introduces, removes, or varies it, and then they look at what happens to the dependent variable based on that. The dependent variable is your outcome. So in an experiment, if you think about experimental research, it would be what was caused, what happened, or what changed as a result of the study. When you're looking at different groups, the group classification, or how the researcher manipulates the participants into one group or the other, like a treatment group and a non-treatment group, that classification becomes the independent variable, and then the comparison of the groups, or what they differ on, becomes that dependent variable. All right, so kind of continuing on with that, when you think about just independent variables, they can either be manipulated or selected, right? So a manipulated variable is that the changed condition that the researcher creates during the study. And so, like I said before, that can be that experimental or the treatment variable. Whereas the selected variable is an independent variable that already exists within the group. So let's say I had a group of students and I put them into two categories. One that was going to receive a reading intervention and one group that was not going to receive the intervention. My manipulated variable or treatment variable becomes that reading intervention, whereas then if I wanted to look at my results and look at the students who didn't get the intervention and the students who did get the intervention, and then within those two groups I looked at, let's say, how the girls did versus the boys, so that gender, in that case, the fact that I'm looking at female students, that is my selected variable, right? So it's an independent variable, but it already exists. It's nothing that I can manipulate. It's not a condition that I am creating in that study. So it's a categorical variable that becomes my independent, one of my selected independent variable. Little confusing, I know. All right, so kind of a graphic to summarize that relationship between independent and dependent variables. The independent variables, remember, is that presumed or possible or posited cause, and that somehow affects the dependent variable, which is the outcome or the results. So there's some other types of variables that they talk about in the chapter. So one of those is outcome variable, and generally this is a dependent variable that's quantitative. Studies that would have outcome variables would would have a categorical independent variable within that study, and primarily the researcher is interested in the effects that might lead to the differences in the method. So it's really focused on outcome and what's different about the outcomes. So then you have a moderator variable, and this is a special type of independent variable, and this kind of goes back to the example I gave before about the reading intervention. So a moderator, if you think about, okay, so an independent variable's relationship to its dependent variable may change under different conditions. So that condition is the moderator variable. So if you think about, if you studied, two different methods of teaching reading, one of those methods of teaching reading could work better with boys than with girls. The method of teaching reading is the independent variable, and then reading achievement is the dependent variable. Actually, I think I have a little graphic. There we go. Gender becomes the moderator there because it moderates or it changes the relationship between that independent variable, which was the teaching method, and the dependent variable, which was reading achievement. So if you take a look at this, then suppose that we did a study of reading achievement where we compared whole language with phonics, right? We could also then include students' socioeconomic status as a variable. If students are randomly assigned to either whole language instruction or phonics instruction, there are going to be students of high and low SES in each group, right? So what if we were studying this and we found that whole language instruction worked better than phonics instruction with the high SES students, but that the phonics instruction worked better than the whole language instruction with the low SES students? All right, so later on when we get in the semester, when we get to our more statistics part, we'll learn that this is what's called an interaction effect. But in this study, the language instruction, which was our dependent variable, right, with two levels, the phonics and the whole language, the socioeconomic status was the moderator variable, right? So there's two levels, low or high, and then the reading achievement is the dependent variable. So that's, if you think about it, it's measured on a continuous scale, right? So there aren't necessarily levels. With a moderator variable, we find that the type of instruction in this case did make a difference, but it worked differently for the two different groups, right? So if we had designed this study, we would select this moderator variable because we think that it is a variable that will moderate the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable, right? And this would be a decision that we would make before we start the study. If we did not have that moderator in this study, right? If we did not consider the low socioeconomic status and the high socioeconomic status, we would have said that there's no difference in the reading achievement between the two types of reading instruction because we just got our results, but we didn't necessarily look into it deeper, into the other things that could be manipulating or influencing how that independent variable of the instruction was influencing the dependent variable of student achievement. So this would have happened because what our data would have looked like would be that the average of the high and low scores in each of these different groups would essentially kind of cancel each other out in both the phonics instruction and the whole language instruction. So it just would have given us an average of the reading achievement in each group. It wouldn't really have broken it down. So our results would have been different, right? So that's why it's important to, if you're going to have a moderator variable, that it needs to be considered at the outset of the study. Alright, so just let's move on from that. Don't get too caught up in the nitty-gritty. Definitely take your quiz and look at some of the differences between those, but it can be confusing, especially when you're thinking about it kind of out of context, like you're just reading about it and you're not doing a particular study. But an extraneous variable is another type of variable they have. So an extraneous variable is essentially factors that cannot be controlled, right? So extraneous variables, independent variables that you can't control for, they're considered a basic problem in most research. And so when you come up with your plans and your proposals, the task is your task is to try to control these variables by reducing or eliminating their effects, which can become kind of difficult sometimes, and we'll talk more about that as we move on. But one method to control them is to hold them constant, right? So if you think about that study before, where I talked about the difference between the whole language and the phonics, we had, socioeconomic status was our moderator variable, and we thought that it would influence how those two types of instruction worked on or influenced student achievement. So one of the ways then that you could control for socioeconomic status is to make sure that in your study, all of your participants belong to the same socioeconomic status, the same group. So since you can't necessarily control the effect that high and low might have, you just take your study and you just study one of those. So I would just study the effects of phonics and whole language on low SES students, right? So you kind of would then get this, you should get the same results that I described before when we were talking about moderator variables. But if you hadn't selected that, one way that you control for it is to make it a constant. So in this case, SES would be the constant. So this is an example, and this is just right from your text. So the principal of a high school compares the final exam scores of two classes taught by teachers using different methods. So this is exactly like my reading example, right? And so if you just look at the situations and the things going on in these two different classes, there's a lot of extraneous variables going on in there. So the age of the teachers, the gender of the teachers, the gender of the students in the class, the size of the class, the time of the class meets each day, the ethnicity of the teacher, how long the class is, the days of the week that the class meets. Those are really factors that you can't, they're extraneous variables, right? So you can't really control them. So you need to design your study so that your study can make some of those constant. So it just means that you narrow your questions and you narrow the scope of your proposal to try to control for some of those different extraneous variables. All right. So the very end of your chapter talks about a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is essentially just a prediction regarding the possible outcome of a study. So the reason we stick this in with our discussion of independent variables is because, remember, the variables that you select are influenced by the presumption of what you think is happening in this phenomenon, or what you think is going to happen as the outcome of this study. So the hypothesis goes along with that because you, as a researcher, are making a prediction regarding what you think that outcome is going to be. So it can be helpful to actually turn your question into a hypothesis, because what you can do then is you can help narrow and select what your independent and dependent variables are going to be, and then all of those classifications of variables within both of those. We talked a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of taking your research question and restating it as a hypothesis. So some of the advantages of stating your hypothesis includes what I was kind of just alluding to, is that it forces us to really think more deeply and specifically about the possible outcomes of the study. It enables us to make more specific predictions based on what our theoretical framework or argument is for the study, or based on prior evidence or findings that we came across when we reviewed the literature. So it can also, for us, help to clarify whether we are or are not investigating an actual relationship, because that's kind of the whole point in identifying variables in your study, is that you are looking to investigate a relationship. You're not looking to do a descriptive study. So taking your question and restating it as a hypothesis will give you more of an idea if indeed you are investigating a relationship. But there's also kind of disadvantages to stating that hypothesis, and that's where bias comes into play. So, we talked about the fact, again, that the researcher selects the variables kind of based on some of their presumptions in designing the study. And so constantly thinking about what you think is going to happen and then restating that as a hypothesis can lead to bias on the part of the researcher or the research team. In certain kinds of studies, it's considered presumptuous to predict what you think the findings are going to be. And then there's also that kind of unintended consequence or suspicion or criticism that the stating the hypothesis could potentially cause the researcher or the research team to push the results in the direction that they believe is going to happen, because they believe this is going to be the outcome, and so that they only are looking at their results through a lens that affirms their prediction or affirms their hypothesis. So it's definitely a criticism of many studies. So this is just I thought, a neat example of how many hypotheses you could come up with from a single research question. And so one of the things that I noticed that this chapter left out was the idea of the null hypotheses. But essentially, your null hypotheses is just that you're taking your question and you're writing it as a statement that says there is no relationship. So if we come across that later, or we come across it in some of our articles, that's what they're talking about. Essentially just taking your question and restating it as a hypothesis in the form of a negative. Alright, so what we need to know about hypothesis, besides the idea of, should we state them, should we take our questions and turn them into hypotheses, is this directional versus non-directional hypothesis. So a directional hypothesis is one in which the researcher indicates the specific direction that he or she expects will emerge in their relationship. They base this expectation or this hypothesis on their prior experience. That could be personal experience, the experience of others, and then what they've found in the literature. So in a directional hypothesis, it uses comparison terms like greater than, less, better, or worse. So if you see that, you know that that is a directional hypothesis. So it's directional because it predicts that there will be a difference between two groups, and it specifies kind of how those groups will differ. So then, as opposed to a non-directional hypothesis, there's no specific prediction about what direction the outcome of a study is going to take. And so sometimes, when you're looking at a problem or a phenomenon, it's difficult to make specific predictions about that study. So with a non-directional hypothesis, it simply predicts that there's going to be a difference between the two groups, or there's going to be an effect, right? So when you see that, that's a non-directional. So it's non-directional because it predicts that there will be a difference, but it doesn't really specify how or what that difference is going to be. So it doesn't really try to quantify it. So in terms of hypotheses and qualitative research, qualitative researchers typically don't state a hypothesis at the beginning of their study. It's something that emerges as the study progresses and as they're involved in the research, right? When you do qualitative research, you're kind of more interested in describing the phenomena and generating the hypothesis rather than testing them, right? So this idea of variables is much different when we're talking about qualitative research, and this idea of hypothesis is much different. So with qualitative research or field research, you're really aiming to describe some phenomenon of behavior, and you don't have a kind of preconceived notion about what you think is going to happen, or this actual stated preconceived hypothesis that you're going to test. They emerge from that observation and interpretation of the phenomenon of the human behavior. Generally, that's what it is, human behavior. So that it leads to further observation and then the generation of new hypotheses or new areas that you can explore. When qualitative researchers do state their ideas before they begin a study, they're called propositions rather than hypotheses. So this idea of a proposition is not that I'm going out to test to see if this prediction is correct, like you do with hypotheses, but rather it's this flexible tool intended to help guide the researchers as they collect their data and they start to analyze their data. All right, so that's kind of the overview, the down and dirty of our chapter on variables and hypotheses. So hopefully you've already read, you've taken a look at the screencast, you should go and you should definitely take the multiple choice quiz, and then I'll have some other resources up there for you so that you can kind of wrap your head around this whole idea of variables and hypothesis.